In today's episode, we are going to hear from a landowner who saw the strangest thing on his property while fishing. Then we are going to travel back in time to 1976 to hear a terrifying encounter. And finally, we're going to get into a story with an off-duty officer that happens to stumble upon the most heinous crime he's ever witnessed. But before we get into the stories, if you're a regular listener and haven't subscribed, I promise I don't bite. Or maybe I do. Now let's get into the stories. This happened about 2 weeks ago when I was fishing on my property just outside of a little town in Georgia. My property has been in the family for several generations. I grew up here and been fishing here all my life, and I'll be 70 years old come this October. I know the woods and swamps around here like the back of my hand. We have about 50 acres of land, and one of my favorite fishing spots is a small lake on our property. It's maybe 3 acres in size. The water comes from an underground spring, so it's fresh water. I go fishing Sunday nights, and I usually take my grandson out with me. But he was out of town this week, so I decided to go by myself. I've been doing this pretty much every weekend for the past 10 years. I started fishing from my canoe, and really wasn't able to catch much, so I went over to one of my favorite spots on the shore where there's a lot of shade from the trees. After about 10 minutes of fishing, I hear this thrashing sound coming from my right. The lake goes back into this little cove where the trees are really dense. It was coming from there. It sounded like an animal thrashing around trying to get through the brush. I thought maybe it was a deer or something caught in those briars. So I walked over through this little trail that we had formed over the years to see what was going on. When I got back there, all was quiet again. But when I started walking around the cove looking for whatever had made that noise, I noticed this strong odor coming from one spot under some bushes near a tree trunk. It smelled like something dead that had been lying out in the sun for several days. That kind of smell can knock you down if you're not expecting it. But this wasn't too bad because there was also a faint odor of musk with it that helped take away some of that sting from the dead smell. I didn't see anything at first because the sun was just starting to set and the brush was pretty thick. But then I noticed something right before I decided to head back. I could see it clearly, but it looked like this giant winged bird eating something. I could half see its body and the back of its head. It had these huge wings that were folded up and looked gray and smooth, and it had its head down like it was eating something, possibly an animal. I have never seen a bird this large before. I yelled at it to see if I could get it to turn around, and when it did, it swung its head around and looked right at me. It had these huge red eyes that almost looked like they were powered by LEDs or something. It was definitely eating something because its beak was covered in blood. It stood up and started shaking its wings as it was making this screaming sound. It was terrifying. It reminded me something right out of a Jurassic World movie because I just recently took my grandson to see the latest movie about a month ago. In all my years, I've never seen something like this. When it stood up, it had to be at least as tall as I was. I slowly started walking backwards from on the trail to my ATV I had parked on the shoreline. As I started backing away, this thing turned around and kept on eating whatever it was eating. I finally got to my ATV and drove back to the house. My wife was in the kitchen when I got home, and I told her what had happened. I wanted to do something, but I just didn't know what to do. I wasn't going back down there because now it was starting to get dark. And I'm not going to call animal control and tell them that I just saw a dinosaur. We live in a small town and word gets around real quick. I don't want it getting out that I'm some crazy old man. I found your channel because I started researching the internet after I had this encounter, and I was trying to figure out what I saw. I still don't know what it is because it doesn't quite match anything out there exactly. Maybe someone out there who has seen this will come forward. Thanks for your time. I was about 14 years old when I had my first encounter. It was the summer of 1976, and my family had just moved to a new house in the country outside of Granite Falls, Minnesota. My dad had just started a new job at the paper mill, and we were getting settled into our new home. The house was situated on several acres of land that backed up to thick woods. We didn't have any neighbors yet, as everyone lived further down the road towards town. One night, sometime around 10 p.m., I was awakened by some strange noises coming from outside my bedroom window. At first, I thought it might be kids goofing off, but what I heard next sent chills down my spine. There were these very loud screams coming from the woods behind our house. They sounded like they came from something much larger than a person. These screams lasted for about 5 minutes, then stopped abruptly. After listening for a few moments, I realized that whatever it was has got to be standing outside my bedroom window, which faced the backyard and the woods. A few moments later, there were sounds again coming from right outside my window. This time, it sounded like something was being thrown against the wall of my bedroom. I could hear things being thrown and hitting the side of the house as well. My brother, who was sleeping in the next room, woke up at all the commotion and came into my room to see what was going on. We both sat in my bed trying to figure out what was happening, when we heard a loud thud right outside my window. We quickly turned on our lamp and looked over at the window just in time to see a dark figure moving away from our window towards the back of the house. The figure was moving so fast. We both were scared out of our minds, but also curious about what we had just seen. Now, my brother and I were quite the daredevils back then, so after a few moments, we decided to go outside and try to find some clues as to what might have been responsible for all the strange noises and exactly what that dark figure was. When we opened our front door, there were no lights on inside or outside of our home, which made things even more creepy than they already were. We slowly walked down off of our front porch towards the back of the house. We walked around the side of the house and noticed that there were these large footprints in the soft dirt where we had been planning a patio for our new home. The prints were much larger than anything I've ever seen before. These footprints were huge. We followed the tracks down towards the woods behind our house, only to have them disappear once they reached an area covered in dry leaves. We decided it was probably best to go inside because it was getting late. We also didn't have any weapons on us to defend ourselves. After going back inside, I went into my bedroom and turned on my light, just as I heard another loud scream coming from the woods behind our house. The next morning, I told my mom about everything that had happened during the night. She thought maybe someone might have been messing around with us, but quickly changed her mind after seeing the large footprints outside of our window. We all agreed that whatever it was must have been much larger than a person. A few nights later, my brother and I decided to go outside after everyone had gone to bed to see if we could hear anything unusual going on around our house. We were determined to see whatever this creature was. We walked out onto our front porch and sat down on the steps leading up to the porch. It was very quiet except for the sounds of animals in the woods around us. After a few moments, we heard a noise coming from the woods behind our house. It sounded like something large moving through the underbrush towards our house. That's when we saw it. This large, hairy figure coming from out of the woods, swaying back and forth as it walked towards our house. We both immediately jumped and went inside, and I started yelling for my parents. They came running downstairs and asked us what is going on. We told them that there was a large hairy man that came out of the woods. My dad turned on the back porch light and saw something walking back into the woods. I asked him, "Did you see it, Dad?" His face turned white as a ghost. All he said to us is, "You kids need to get into bed. Come on, go upstairs." I mentioned it to my dad since, but he always changes the subject. My brother and I know we saw Bigfoot that night. I've been ordered not to share this story since it involves law enforcement, and also because no one would ever believe it. So now I'm butchering my credibility by not telling you where I'm from or where this took place, but that's okay. I feel like the exposure of this story is more important than anything else, so I'm okay keeping things anonymous. I was off duty and driving through a residential neighborhood, because why not? Things happen in broad daylight in places that could easily be next door, so I made a pass through your average suburbia. There was this 3-story house that seemed to have a cul-de-sac all to itself, and no sooner had I passed it, I heard gunshots and screaming. I mentally patted myself on the back for deciding to turn through here. I got out and charged the door with my service pistol drawn. I crashed through the front door and yelled that the police were on premises. The house had no answer. This bothered me. Things just don't go from 0 to 100 then right back to 0. I did a full sweep of the lower level of the house, all while calling out warning signs to any perpetrators. The ground level was empty. I went up the first flight of steps I could find, and there was a swath of blood all along the white carpet that led from one room to another. I picked a direction and followed. My choice brought me to where things had started. A bedroom where there were apparent bullet holes in the wall, with blood spattering. So somebody had landed their rounds. Also, a bed that was not only bathed in blood, but shredded up in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I sized it up to somebody that had fired shots in self-defense, but their attacker wasn't stopped, and they must have had a machete or something, because the level of violence displayed on this bed was ridiculous. This wasn't just a war, this was a massacre. Something heinous happened. So I continued to follow the trail of blood in the opposite way. It led to a very strange oddity. A closed-up stairwell that went into the basement down below. I wouldn't have found it on the ground floor. It was accessible only from the basement and from the second story. I had never heard of a house having this, or ever seen any sort of construction like this before, but I digress. The trail of blood went down the carpeted steps, down into the basement where the lights were off. So I gripped my gun tightly and slowly made my descent. I steeled myself and proceeded, changing my tactics to being quiet. Anybody that makes this big of a mess had to be some type of serial killer or something, so I shouldn't take my chances. Of course, what are the chances that this would all happen when I was off duty, and I just got to be part of it? The basement looked to be mostly a man cave, and down there I saw signs of another struggle when I flicked on the lights. Well, they didn't stay on for very long. I heard a flick from somewhere else and they went off. I tried the same light switch and the lights came back on. And again, they went off. I yelled that I knew they were down there and they needed to stop playing games. What happened next was so fast to this day I still doubt my own memory. It was too bizarre, too strange. I flicked on the lights for the third time and charged my way into the basement as silently as possible, keeping my weapon ready and drawn. I wanted to catch where the sound of the other switch was coming from, and I found it. I honed in on it. I produced my tactical light and told whoever was in the cone of the light to freeze. Clutching a bloody and mutilated body was simply a monster straight out of the nightmares of any person. It was a wolf with long legs and long arms and blood-matted fur all around its face. But this wasn't just a wolf. It was standing upright like that of a man. It even had the body and length of a man, and the chest and arms and the shoulders. This was basically a muscle-bound man covered in thick matted fur with an extremely large head of a wolf. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This was like out of a horror movie. It stood so tall that the ceiling forced it to hunch over. I emptied my entire magazine into it. It dropped the body and almost danced around the room, swatting at the bullets like they were flies. Even though I knew I hit this thing, somehow I lost sight of it in the darkness. Even though I knew I hit this thing, somehow I lost sight of it in the darkness. It escaped the cone of light from my tactical light. I had no idea where it had gone, and it was gone. I did a double check of the room. Every nook and cranny was scoured through and covered, but I never saw any trace of it or where it could have gone. I even checked back upstairs. Even though it would have been impossible to get up there without me knowing, I never found it. I had the coroner show up, and they took the bodies away. The thing had killed 4 people inside the house and was taking them to the basement. I waited for the story to drop, but it never did. When I asked about it, I was told that I would keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep my job and not be persecuted, among other heinous things. I'm sorry, but I have to tell somebody. The case was kept very, very quiet, and in fact, even the family was told by other family members that the people died under mysterious circumstances. Not even so much as an animal attack. It was unusual. I believe the higher-ups knew something that I didn't, because when I tried to explain to them what I saw, I was quickly dismissed and threatened with lots of horrible things. That's my story.